Caroline Sherburne.
Sherburne.
Sherburne. Caroline is originally from
From California.
California, but has
I
been
got
here
to Texas as soon as I could.
and stayed. Her family consists of.
I have 2 children, 6 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren.
Wow.
I'm very blessed.
Yes, and her daytime hours is spent.
Now that I'm retired from teaching high school, I do a great deal of volunteer work and gardening and that sort of thing.
Good. Help me welcome Caroline.
Thank you. Looking for love in all the wrong places is the name of my story. And I'm also a country music singer. I had aspirations to be the next Joan Baez back in the old days in the 70s. I was one of the founding mothers of the San Carlos Folk Music Club in California, and so I am a believer that, and you'll hear later in my story, that God finds us in the places that the niches that He's founded in our hearts and our desires. And with me, it certainly was poetry and music. He gave me a lot of talents, one of which is writing poetry and being able to sing, which I love dearly. I'm also a good cook. I spend a lot of time crocheting and quilting and embroidery, and I'm also athletic by His grace. I played tennis as a young person and swam, and now I'm doing a lot of walking, and I've even gotten back into weightlifting thanks to the onset of osteoporosis. But my best talent, I think, in my whole life, something that's served me, is that I'm really good at problem solving. I'm an expert at making mistakes and turning them into unique solutions. I've done this in everything from baking bread to quilting, and as well as selling real estate. I looked at real estate as a minefield. I knew there would be some momentous issue to solve, but I never knew where it would be and when it would occur, but I knew it would be there. And I always tell anybody who's interested in real estate who thinks anything other than that is going to be very unhappy in that profession. I was blessed to be raised in a very religious environment by a mother who was very devout. But it was a church that didn't talk a lot about Jesus or spend a lot of time reading the Bible per se, although every day there are daily readings from the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Psalms. So I was certainly well acquainted with the story of Jesus, and also I went through religious schooling in my from 1st to 8th grade, and actually on through my sophomore year in high school. And I was also married in the faith, and I spent a lot of time after my marriage, the next 18 years, in practicing the faith, but I must say I was practicing more than I was spiritually involved, because I hadn't grown up with the notion of a personal relationship with my Savior. That was really a rather strange idea to me. But looking back, I realized that when I was 12 years old and I was in a darkened church listening to my mother, the organist and choir director, directing the choir while they were practicing for the Christmas midnight mass, they were playing and singing "Lo, how a rose ere blooming," and I felt, and I'm getting those people call God bumps, but whatever. I felt the presence of Christ or God or whoever you want to call it. So I do, looking back on it, think that I had that realization as a young child. But at any rate, I didn't remain married, and when it was actually kind of late in my let's see, I was pregnant with my second child. I had my first child. So it was about 5 years into my marriage. I had a very difficult experience at a church service and walked away from the church for a good 20 years. And during that time, I have to say I was very lost. I did search around in different denominations and never felt like there was one that was home to me, because I'd grown up in a very contemplative religious environment, and most of the churches were a little more like going to a rock concert to me than going to church. So, but I did make an effort. But I was very away from God on a personal level and spiritual level, and I got into a whole lot of trouble, I have to say. I did, as I said, spend some time in the real estate industry. And during that time, I got involved, this was after I was no longer married, I got involved with a man who was a Vietnam vet, and a very sick alcoholic Vietnam vet. And when he drank, he said that was the only time he didn't hear the voices of the Viet Cong screaming. And this is a 19-year-old boy that was sent out in the jungle he was a Navy SEAL, and he was sent out to kill certain operatives of the Viet Cong. And it was a terrible, terrible thing. And it broke my heart, but we ended up living together, and he was in a desperate situation trying to drink himself to death. And it's a wonder he didn't use one of his guns, but because he was, in the military. And I was becoming more and more desperate, and so I did turn to the Bible, namely the Psalms, because I had always been a poet, and the Psalms were poetry that sort of played out every human emotion and every human experience, so they really spoke to me. And one night when I was reading the Psalms, I was just terribly, terribly desperate, and I got down on my knees, as my daughter had told me to do, who had become a born-again Christian, much to my chagrin at that time. But she said, ask Christ to be your Savior, and I was so desperate for myself and for this man, and I thought he was going to kill himself, that I did in fact get down on my knees that night at 3 o'clock in the morning and surrender and ask Christ to be my Savior. And I had a really miraculous experience, because it wasn't 5 hours later that I got a phone call from this young man's mother. And I had never spoken to the woman, didn't know who she was, and she said, "Is he there?" And I said, "Yes, and he's trying to drink himself to death. You have to do something." And so 5 hours later, she showed up at my door and took him, and she and her husband took him to a rehab. And the last time that I spoke to him in California, he was sober and had gotten back with his children. But what had happened to me was even more miraculous, because after he left, and I sat, I was in shock, I think, from the whole experience. I was reading the Psalms again, and it was as if the veil had been lifted, and they suddenly spoke to me in a whole different way. I understood the Bible in a way that I never had before. It had just been words and poetry, and now it was a personal experience. And what was even more interesting to me, that desire to read the Bible has never left me. And coming from the religious environment that I did, that was a very unique experience, and I still read the Bible every day. And I really strongly feel that anyone who has been lost in his or her life, I offer to each and every one of you the invitation to enter into a personal relationship with Christ, because I found He is the way, the truth, and the life, the only way, the only truth, and the only life. And only through Christ have I been able to experience peace on earth and look forward to a life of eternal happiness. So if you've heard Christ beckoning to you, do not harden your hearts, but get down on your knees and simply ask Christ to be your Savior. There's nothing complicated about it, but I won't promise you an easy journey, because there have been many hills and many valleys for me during my time of learning to walk with Christ. And it's a journey that I continue every day. And I really look forward to talking to anyone who is interested in what I've experienced. Thank you.